Well, welcome back. My name is Doug Abrams, and I'm the moderator of this panel. Since we have been going on for 2 panels already, I thought that I would let you in on the secret of how Professor Wells and I and the law review editors and staff assembled such a good array that we have here today. We sat down in July to begin to plan this, and we came up with a first string and a second string. And the first string, we knew we needed 9 speakers, and the first string had about 11 or 12 there. We were hoping to get 9. If we had to go to the second string, we still would have had a great group of speakers. The talent pool was that deep. I will tell you that we didn't have to. We have all our first stringers, including the 3 members of this panel. And since we're now, you've just had the 7th inning stretch, we're in late innings. Let me just introduce these last 3 all-stars that are going to be talking to you. The first speaker will be Dr. Susan Limber. Dr. Limber from Clemson University. She is from the land of the Clemson Tigers, and she's now had hospitality along with Dr. Small here in the land of the Missouri Tigers. I'm not going to read their biographies to you because it takes just too much time to go through the credentials of people like this. You have the biographies at the table. I will simply tell you, to introduce each of them, I'll just tell you a little story about each. With Dr. Limber, about 4 years ago, I got the invitation to write a chapter on cyberbullying for a book on educational equality. It just so happened that the book was co-edited by Professor Weddle here. And I was high on enthusiasm and low on background and knowledge, so I figured the first thing I would do is read some of the literature and see what was going on. And the name Susan Limber kept coming up over and over again. So I figured I would read some of that stuff. And her writing and her thought process is, first of all, very, very solid and very informative, but also very practical. And you will see why she is the Dan Olweus, a distinguished professor at Clemson. Dan Olweus is a name that you've heard before. He's a pioneering Norwegian researcher in cyberbullying from the 1970s and 1980s. And so to have a distinguished chair, an endowed chair in that name indicates that cyberbullying and bullying in general is a major focus of Dr. Limber's work, and you'll see why in a few minutes. Our second, and Dr. Limber will need, along with Dr. Small, will need to catch a plane from Kansas City mid-afternoon, so they're going to leave. She will leave after her presentation, so we'll interrupt before we go to the second and third speakers. And any questions that you might have for her, we will do before we go to the second and third speaker. The second speaker is Dr. Professor Daniel Weddle from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And this panel, the first panel yesterday, dealt with legal issues, which Professor Weddle was very capable of speaking on. The second panel this morning dealt with psychological issues. The third panel here deals with practical issues, and not only is Dr. Limber practical, but Professor Weddle has been a high school teacher, has been a high school administrator, is a professor at UMKC who teaches, among other things, education law, the former assistant dean of the UMKC Education School. So he will also have plenty to tell us about the practicalities and what goes on actually in the classrooms and in the schools, what needs to go on in the classroom and in the schools. He is most recently the co-editor of an anthology called Our Promise, Achieving Educational Equality for America's Children, which consists of about 24 essays, 24 chapters on educational equality. One of those chapters written by a professor at the University of Missouri Columbia Law School. Our third and final speaker will be Lieutenant Joe Laramie. I still call him Lieutenant because that's what he was when I first met him a couple of years ago on a panel. He has spent 30 years as a police officer involved in child protection issues. More recently, he was a leader in the Missouri Attorney General's office in this issue, and is now in private consulting. But he has also a broad range. I've heard him speak a couple of times, a very broad range of experiences that he'll bring to bear here. So without any further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Limber to you, the first of our three speakers on this panel.
Thank you so much. There we go. Thanks so much for having me. I guess I'm the 8th in a long line of speakers to thank our very, very gracious host for inviting us. And it's been really a pleasure and an honor to be invited and to be here. And I do apologize for being the reason that your coffee break was cut short. That is never a good position to be in. So thank you for understanding the need to get home to a 7-year-old at the other end, late at night, believe it or not. It's not easy to get from a non-hub city to a non-hub city, as many of you have discovered. So what I'd like to do very practically, and I think you're right on that my talk is going to move very practically into best practices in the schools. I'd like to address these questions, time permitting, and there may be scant attention to the second and last, but what I'd like to do is give a snapshot first of what are schools doing to address bullying, not just cyberbullying, but bullying in general. What are some misdirections? A few have already come up in the talks previously, but what are some well-intentioned but missteps in our efforts to address bullying? Then turning to cyberbullying in particular, what are best practices, best that we know them right now, in prevention and intervention in cyberbullying? As time permits, I'll touch on things that I think will be discussed a little bit more detail. How should school personnel respond to cyberbullying when preventive efforts haven't worked and an incident arises? And then finally, I want to leave you with some links to some other resources that may be of use to you. So with that, let me just mention that although there is little or no official tracking of schools' efforts nationally to address bullying, this is a very non-scientific individual assessment of what, in my experience, schools are doing to address bullying. And it suggests there's a wide range of responses, ranging from nothing. Some schools are still not addressing bullying in any systematic or conscious way, often despite, I should add, having a law in place in their state that requires a policy at least to be on the books. Many others are doing something to address bullying, and many more, in my experience, than were even a few years ago. So we've certainly seen good progress there. But for those schools that are doing something to address bullying, what are they doing? It varies a good bit from district to district, and even from school building to school building. And here's my laundry list briefly. Many, I think, are focusing on awareness-raising efforts, right? We want to have some maybe once-a-year training for our staff, assemblies for our students, maybe a good PTO speaker for our parents. Others, in part because of the requirements of many of the state laws, are focusing on reporting and tracking of bullying incidences, and I think Dan's going to go into more detail on that in a little bit. Others focus on the discipline end, and some on the harsh discipline end, perhaps looking at zero-tolerance policies or student exclusion policies that focus on suspension or expulsion, and I'll touch on that a little bit more in a moment. Others are looking at what we can do to help children who are bullied. Is there social skills training for victims, for example, to help increase their resiliency? Others are looking at individual or group treatment, either for kids who've been bullied or perhaps those who bully others. We've heard a little bit about mediation or conflict resolution programs that are common in many schools, and some schools are using these programs to address bullying incidents. We've also heard there are vast numbers of curricula out in the last 10 years or so that many schools are making use of. And finally, An increasing number of schools are adopting comprehensive approaches to bullying prevention, whereby a whole school is engaged in efforts to prevent bullying systemically. So, and I'm sure you can add to this laundry list, but the point is schools are doing a lot of different things in their best efforts to address bullying. And before I turn to what I consider to be elements or principles of best practice, I want to highlight some misdirections. And unfortunately, some intervention and prevention strategies that have been used primarily by very well-meaning, well-intentioned educators and policymakers are not supported by the research or our understanding of what best practices are. And I wanted to highlight a few of these. So, some schools, as we've noted, have adopted zero tolerance policies or three strikes policies towards bullying, in which children who bully others are suspended or expelled from school, or in the case of Georgia law, if they physically bullied children 3 times or more often, were to be sent to an alternative school setting. Sometimes they're called student exclusion policies, and in my opinion raise quite a few concerns, some of which have come up over the course of the symposium. First is, we've heard a lot of different numbers presented on how many kids are involved in bullying, but I think the message is lots of kids try out bullying behaviors at some point in their lives. My own data find at least about 1 out of 4 or 5 kids admit to bullying others on an anonymous survey with some frequency. So that's an awful lot of kids to be looking at excluding from the school environment. Another concern with zero tolerance policies is they can have a chilling effect on the willingness of teachers or kids to report bullying if they're concerned about these kids being suspended or expelled, right? A third concern is bullying behaviors are often a marker for kids' involvement in a variety of troubling behaviors. And I would argue that these children are in desperate need of positive pro-social role models wherever possible within the school environment, rather than being excluded from this environment. So, of course, in some rare cases, public safety may demand student exclusion, but too often I think we've seen that this is a bullying prevention strategy. And actually, suspension and expulsion is named in at least 8 or 9 state laws as something for educators to consider. So, another misdirection I wanted to highlight has come up a little bit: conflict resolution and peer mediation. These are common strategies in a number of schools for dealing with conflicts between students, and some schools are using these to address bullying, between bullying problems, which is not recommended in most cases. Why? Well, bullying, as I think has been well established, is a form of peer abuse or victimization. It's not a conflict. Phil and others really highlighted the power differential, which is key. Second, mediating a bullying incident can send very inappropriate messages to both kids involved. You're both partly right, you're both partly wrong. You have to work out this conflict between you. That's the wrong message for both parties, I would argue. And third, we hear this from kids often, that mediation really can further victimize a child who, in many cases, this may be the last thing that they want to do is face their tormentor. And I may touch on this later. In some cases, restorative justice practices may be appropriate, but these typically require a lot of time and training by professionals. These are situations that aren't common in most of our school settings where these situations arise. So a caution there. Another strategy that some schools have used to address bullying behavior involves group therapeutic treatment for children involved in bullying, and I'll highlight here children involved in bullying others, whether it's anger management or perhaps skill building or empathy building or self-esteem enhancement. And again, although well-intentioned, I would argue that these group interventions are often very counterproductive. For anybody who's trying to facilitate a group of antisocial kids, they are often, of course, serving as poor or excellent, however you look at it, role models for each other's antisocial behavior, and can reinforce the bullying behavior. finally, I wanted to highlight that often school administrators and staff, understandably, given the many pressures on them, look to adopt a short-term or piecemeal approach to bullying prevention. Again, it may be the topic of staff in service once. They may bring in somebody for a jazzy school assembly once, or there may be a 2-week curriculum that has a beginning and an end. And I would argue that although each of these efforts may play a role in helping to, baby steps in adopting a more comprehensive effort to address bullying, in and of themselves, we've got no reason to believe they will do anything to address bullying or reduce bullying problems. So, starting with the negative and then moving to, well, what are elements of best practices? I'm going to focus here on principles of best practice, not a program in particular, and focus now on cyberbullying to the best of our knowledge. So, although many of these, I should say, do relate to bullying in general. Given the newness of this phenomenon, we're really lacking rigorous or even not very rigorous evaluations of our cyberbullying prevention efforts. However, I've pulled together these recommendations with my colleagues, my book co-authors, Robin Kowalski and Patty Agatston, based on what we know about research on youth aggression, what we know about from research on bullying prevention, and our experiences in our use of best practices in the field. But consider this a version 1.0 or 2.0, right, of best practices in cyberbullying prevention, and it certainly will be informed by continued research and modified by ongoing research. So my first element of best practice is going to sound familiar from what many of the other speakers have had to say, which is to incorporate cyberbullying prevention into comprehensive bullying prevention efforts. Many schools have begun implementing comprehensive school-wide bullying prevention programs as a result of conclusions from researchers that although these very short-term, quick fixes to bullying prevention are not likely to have any effect, those that really focus on changing the norms within the social environment of the school are much more promising. It was mentioned a recent meta-evaluation by Tofing and Farrington concluded, looking at school-based bullying prevention programs, that they can be effective, resulting in 20 to 23% reduction in bullying on average, and that those that embraced a comprehensive approach, those that were in fact inspired by some of the work of Dan Olveus and recognizing a comprehensive approach is needed, worked best. So I would argue that cyberbullying, although I agree with Melissa, may have some interesting differences and twists from traditional forms of bullying. It's a form of bullying, however, and as a result, prevention really of cyberbullying should be addressed in this broader context of the prevention of bullying, and not as an add-on issue, not as a separate issue. So a second element of best practice I would recommend for school personnel is to assess it in your own schools and communities. Just as is the case with more traditional forms of bullying, we as adults really can't assume that we have a good grasp on the nature and frequency of cyberbullying that is occurring among our students. Just as it's recommended practice to regularly collect data about the nature and prevalence of bullying among students in your schools, I would argue that these assessments really should also include assessing cyberbullying that's occurred. These data can be so useful to help monitor the extent of the problem, assess the extent to which there is an overlap in your school between more traditional forms of bullying and cyberbullying, as the data would indicate. They can be used to help motivate your staff to address the issue, assess what is our need for training, and of course evaluate or help to evaluate the impact of your prevention efforts. So most commonly in schools, the data collection involves having students complete anonymous written or perhaps online surveys, but it also, I think, can be very useful for educators to collect more detailed information by holding informal discussion groups, focus groups with kids. What are the specific technologies that are being used to cyberbully here? What do they do if they experience cyberbullying? What effects does it have on them? How often are they witnessing it? So a lot of information you can get by talking to kids in your schools. And I think it's useful to try to get feedback and information, not just from the kids, but from the teachers and the parents. And there's often a big gap, divide between what parents and the teachers think may be going on and what the students do. This will sound familiar again. A third element of best practice is really to look at staff training. Many adults, as we've talked about, still hold misconceptions about bullying. And many adults, of course, are still very new to the social technologies that are using to communicate with one another. So I would argue that all educators and adults who work with kids really could benefit from general staff training on a regular basis on bullying in general, and included in that cyberbullying in particular, with then more in-depth training regarding intervention for key staff, such as administrators, counselors, and media specialists within that school setting. So everybody needs basic, a common basis of knowledge, and then certainly some people will need additional training. Fourth element of best practice, I believe it's critical to develop crystal clear rules and policies about cyberbullying in schools. We talked about this as well in the symposium. And let me start with the school rules, which are often most visible to kids themselves, right? So many schools have found it important to develop widely posted rules, not many of them, but simple rules about bullying behavior that address the behavior of kids who may bully. So rule number one, we won't bully other students, for example. But also to incorporate rules that address the majority of the kids in the school environment who may be bystanders to bullying. So what rules might we have at the school to encourage children to help out if bullying is observed by them, or at least report it to an adult? Cyberbullying as a form of bullying, I would argue, should be really included in these very clear school-wide rules about bullying. Kids need to understand how they apply, not just to the more traditional forms of bullying, but when and how they apply to cyberbullying as well. So let's then look at the policies that we've touched on here and there in the symposium. Just to reiterate, under state law, almost all school districts now have been required to develop school policies on bullying, and most states, as John mentioned yesterday, include cyberbullying within its definition of bullying. That's changed in recent years as more and more add that on to their bills. So the recommendation here is, with guidance from your legal counsel, school personnel really should look to incorporate cyberbullying into your bullying policies if you haven't done that already. I also want to mention the use of technology policies that most schools have. Most schools have policies regarding using the school technology, and it's not just about how you treat others online, but it includes issues of privacy, intellectual property, network security, but also how you interact with others when you're using district resources. Cyberbullying can and should be incorporated in these acceptable use of technology policies as well, and I've listed here, in case you're interested, at cyberbullyingcrime.gov. The government has a model policy in this regard that may be useful to take a look at. So information about your school rules that include cyberbullying, your school policies, really then need to be shared and understood and discussed regularly, not just with students, but with staff and parents as well, who often don't know that they exist. Fifth element of best practice has to do with reporting. Schools typically have methods in place for reporting traditional forms of bullying, and what I want to mention here is that students, staff, and parents should be encouraged to report cyberbullying as well, including the serious behaviors that may happen outside of the school but bleed into the school environment. Now, there are limits to having too much focus on reporting without having other mechanisms in place. But given the reluctance, I would argue, of many students to report cyberbullying, it's really important to look for comfortable and easy ways for them to do this. So many schools have gone to online reporting mechanisms that they can use to let others know what they've been experiencing over and over again. Sixth element of best practice has to do with the time issue that is such a concern to many teachers. But I would argue we have to spend some time, we can save time in the long run if we spend some time talking about these issues with kids in our class. So the topic of cyberbullying should be included, I would argue, in regular class meetings or group discussions on bullying and peer relations and related issues. Many administrators and teachers are really recognizing the benefits of having a time, 20, 30 minutes once a week to put the books away, circle the kids around and have a class meeting. It's a time to build community, that social capital that Mark and others have mentioned seems to be lacking often. It's a time for increasing knowledge and social skills about social issues, for addressing problem behaviors that may be cropping up in the classroom. And importantly, it's a time for teachers to keep their finger on the pulse of kids' concerns. Cyberbullying is a natural topic for these sorts of classroom meetings, and kids love to talk about it. There can be topics such as defining what it is, what the school's rules are, what are the policies regarding cyberbullying in our school. We talk about online etiquette. How do you treat others online? How do you monitor your reputation online? How do you best respond to cyberbullying if you are targeted? And an intriguing aspect of cyberbullying to me has to do with this digital distance that we talked about between the parties. And I'm really interested in the effect that distance may have on witnesses to cyberbullying. So when you're able to see, but when you're not able to see an individual face to face, do you feel less empathy for them if they're bullied online? Are you more or less likely to jump in and try to help in some way? We don't know to a large extent, but given these concerns, activities and discussions in the classroom that can really explore the role of witnesses and the responsibilities of a witness in cyberbullying, help increase empathy, do some role playing about strategies, I think can be really helpful. Other approaches that may be useful in this classroom environment focus on social norming approaches that John and others have also talked about. These have been used relatively effectively in the drug prevention field, so that the idea is that rather than focusing on the percentage of youth and children and youth who are experimenting using alcohol and other drugs, what we do is we share information and statistics about those who are choosing not to. And I think it can help to change the perception that everyone is engaging in problem behavior to the reality that most kids are making good choices. And I think this approach may hold some promise for looking at and addressing risky online behaviors such as sexting or cyberbullying. And just to give an example, here we see the Pew Internet and American Life Project data from their sexting survey, where they found that perhaps this is a surprise to you. I mean, everyone feels that everybody is sexting. They found that 4% of teens aged 12 to 17 had engaged in sending sexually suggestive photos. So the important statistic to share with youth is what? Well, 96% of you haven't. So talk to kids in class meetings about why do most of you think that doing this is a really dumb idea. That can help to change the norms in a classroom environment. Point out that those who did felt pressure to do it, and you let kids start talking about what can you do to respond to pressure. So I think social norming techniques hold some promise. And related to this, and what came up in a recent discussion, is the seventh element of best practices to really use youth as experts or resources. Youth may lack the maturity of adults to understand the implications of their online behaviors. We've heard that over and over again. But on the other hand, they're often more knowledgeable about the digital world than adults, and they really can be empowered to use their knowledge and their skills as models to teach digital citizenship. And I think as well, engaging youth in developing prevention and intervention strategies sends a really important message to them that we value their expertise, their feelings, their ideas, and they can help lead, for example, in campaigns to raise awareness about these norms in cyberbullying. I'll give you an example as I sort of wind up. My colleague, Patty Agatston, did some training at a Georgia high school and was really struck by the energy with which those high school students led a social norming campaign as part of their larger Old Days bullying prevention program. And this was really their message from data they collected in their own school. And again, I think that can have power in addition to the adult environment, leadership that students take a lead role as well. My final element of best practice is really the tricky thing of building stronger school and parent partnerships around this issue. Currently, many parents, probably myself included, feel at a loss in addressing cyberbullying and sometimes cyber anything, right? Due to this digital divide that often exists between adults and children. I think schools can really help to bridge this divide by having parent information nights on cyber issues, sending some printed tips and literature home, and as well giving a contact person a name at the school who can help out when there are questions. And I just wanted to call out a useful free resource that can be ordered in bulk by schools, NetCetera's Chatting with Kids About Being Online, which includes a video for parents, a booklet for parents with tips about talking with kids at different ages about these issues and highlights cyberbullying in particular. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I'm going to leave the intervention suggestions to my fellow panel members since I'm also out of time. And I just wanted to also point to a few other terrific resources for information about either practical tips for prevention of bullying or online etiquette or cyberbullying in particular. I thank you so much for your time, and one or two questions, or have I used up my time and then some before I have the dash?
No, you have not used up your time.
Okay. Thank you.
If you have any questions, Dr. Limber, why don't you come on down to the two microphones here. Okay. I know you.
This may be discussed by the other panelists as well, but the question, when you say there are some schools that have not even adopted policies, though they're required to by state law, how do we get, knowing that this can make a difference, the comprehensive approaches, how does that happen? Is it with the principals, is it with the parents, does the state play a role? How do we go from modern reality to best practices?
Well, you raised a number of good questions, issues. One is that almost all school districts have to be doing something, have at least a policy in place, but sometimes those policies sit on a shelf and there's nothing that's implemented. And that's a huge concern. Another concern is that, as John Humphrey mentioned, too few of the statutes require or even encourage the policies to include prevention efforts. They tend to focus, as my colleagues will highlight, more on the reporting and the discipline, and too often fail to mention prevention strategies or even counseling that may be needed. So I think they may help to raise awareness about the issue, but they really fall short of really encouraging prevention issues. You're fortunate. You got some terrific examples. I'll shout out to some of my colleagues. Wave your hands who are really doing terrific work in comprehensive bullying prevention efforts here in Missouri. And there's not a one-size-fits-all program or strategy for schools, but the fact that we know that these short-term approaches cannot work, and there's no reason to believe they would work, really have to lead us to try to encourage our policymakers to help fund these approaches and highlight the effectiveness.
Okay. Speaking of policymakers, the most recent recent legislation introduced into the Missouri House or Senate, I don't remember his House bill, says that there will be mandatory reporting by staff and students. All staff and students will be required to report. And when I read that, I understand what I can do to a staff member when they don't report. What do I do to a student, and how does that help in the long run when it comes to decreasing bullying?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the stick approach for reporting.
Yeah.
And even if you have rules in your schools that we'll try to help out and we report bullying, you don't punish kids for not doing that, because there are many good reasons that kids will tell you they're not going to stick their necks out. I'm going to leave that. Dan, I know, is going to be nailing that issue, right? Dan? So I would say that I agree with you that stick approach, you want to encourage the reporting by the kids, but mandating it with what if they don't? Is there a sanction? Is there...
No, the legislation doesn't give sanction, just says you have to.
Thanks for your talk. It was very helpful. Two questions that I'm struggling with that I'm asking for help on is, you talk about giving a definition of cyberbullying. As lawyers, we need to have a baseline to work with. At least, I know community approaches are probably the best one, but to establish a legal baseline, we've got to be able to define with some level of precision what is cyberbullying. What's the best definition you've seen out there?
Wow, that's a good question. I'm part of a CDC-sponsored working group right now with a lot of folks who've been pulled together to not even tackle that tough question, but to define bullying. You think that we were there yet, but we really needed to pull folks together because there are many different definitions of bullying. And I will preview that to say that it's likely not to look vastly different than what we've been talking about, the power differential, aggressive behavior, and a repetitive pattern. Those are some core issues. What this group recognizes, cyberbullying is a part of that, so it's not creating a separate definition, but I think there's a general recognition that it is bullying with those three components that occurs using the vast number of cyber technologies available.
But again, if you have like one big Facebook incident or YouTube incident, it's hard to call that repetitive, yet it's definitely serious bullying.
So the two stickiest issues, as you acknowledge, are the repetitive pattern. Is it repetitive if I send it once to bully and then it's forwarded over and over, or if it's posted and it's seen over and over and over? And the other tricky, thorny issue in that three-pronged definition is the power imbalance that can change online. It's not the same power that you might wield face-to-face. Is it power just because I have the ability to reach 10,000 fellow students? Maybe that is enough to create a power differential. So you raise all the questions that we scratch our heads about, and I don't have an easy answer because this is such a new field. We don't have a good enough research basis to really answer those questions.
Well, the second question I have is we talk about all these comprehensive approaches. But as I noted in the study of the cases that are out there, the biggest problem for at least for litigation that's directed against schools is this phenomenon of cyber dissing. And then we have kind of cyber exhibitionism where schools are disciplining that. And then kind of this cyber blustering where it's hard to call it bullying because there's no kind of, there are some people listed, but it's hard to call them targets because you just have these websites where kids are off ranting and raving. So how do you address all these different forms of kind of problematic student cyber speech that schools are asked to intervene about? It seems like, with all these kind of nuanced forms of expression, we talk about these comprehensive approaches, how do we adequately address all these nuanced forms, but yet still get the requisite messages across?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. There's not an easy answer. So I would say, in prevention, let's talk about the example of the class meeting environment. We talk about a lot of issues of concern to kids. It's a great environment for talking about cyberbullying. It's also a great environment for talking about just doing mean things to each other online. I would argue that in basic prevention efforts within a school to create a more positive culture in general, I hope we touch on all these issues. I think teachers the reporting issues, that sometimes behavior just needs to be discussed and corrected, and whether it's technically bullying or whether it's being dissing or mean, I think kids need to have a conversation about how it's not healthy. But I think that can be done in a preventative way. I see my colleagues standing nervously about trying to get us to the airport on time, so I think I better stop there, but thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us, both of you. And our next speaker is Professor Dan Weddle at UNKC Law School.
George Bernard Shaw said something roughly to the effect, those who can do, those who can't teach. I think he missed the mark there. I would say it this way: those who can do, those who can do it and articulate it, teach. Those who can neither do it nor articulate it, run for public office and tell the rest of us how to do it and articulate it. It's a cheap shot, I suppose. We have any legislators in here? I wonder if I'm going to be working on Monday. It's a cheap shot in a sense, but it's true. We have a lot of well-intentioned legislators doing things that are fairly uninformed or ill-informed, and a lot of people getting the ears of legislators who have agendas that may be to make a buck by selling their programs, have other kinds of ugly agendas we'll talk about here in a minute. But this kind of ignorance that finds its way into the legislatures exacerbates some of the fundamental obstacles to effective bullying prevention and what we know about it. And the first thing is just that this lack of understanding. One of the first obstacles is just a basic lack of understanding about a number of things, and one of them is just the dynamics of bullying themselves. And I think it's important to hit this, and I'm not sure it's been driven home really in this conference yet, and that is bullying is an underground activity. The last people to know about it are going to be faculty and administration. And there are reasons for that. First, bullies tend to be bright. They're not, the myth is that they're not very smart and they're making up for their inadequacies. That's not true. Research suggests that they tend to be actually overconfident, have high levels of self-esteem, are popular often, and are bright enough not to get caught. Targets have a tendency not necessarily to tell adults that they are targets because they don't trust the adults not to screw it up and make it worse. They also are often humiliated because what bullies are good at doing is finding a vulnerability. And whether that vulnerability is real or not, in other words, whether it's true or not, they tend to be good at figuring out what your vulnerability is and going after it, which then makes you feel humiliated. And so it's hard to go to your parents and say, I'm being picked on, because you know what parents often say, and they don't mean anything bad by it, but well, what are you doing that makes them want to do that to you? And the answer from the research is you're not doing anything. I mean, there are provocative targets, but targets are typically just random. It's just the bad luck of coming into the firing zone of a bully. But it's tough to go and say, I'm being picked on. Witnesses won't tell. By the way, bystanders, Sue Ellen Freed, a researcher, has suggested that a better term for bystanders is witnesses. Because kids understand from cop shows that witnesses are supposed to come forward, right? If you don't testify, this guy's going to go on and do this again. You know, you have to be ready. And to start talking about them as witnesses is much more proactive view of themselves even. But they don't want to tell, and there are a number of reasons. First of all, the culture says you don't go around tattling on people, right? But also, witnesses are not eager to put themselves in the line of fire either. which is one of the reasons that targets tend to get isolated, which makes it worse for them. So on top of being tormented, they're becoming increasingly isolated from their peers. So as a result, this stuff is not out there where you're going to see it unless you go looking for it in some kind of specific ways. As an administrator, you're not likely to see it because it's not going to be done in front of you. You know who do the professionals or the staff who probably know more about it are going to be the janitorial staff, the cafeteria workers, bus drivers. They have a tendency to see more than the teachers do because the kids aren't really as worried about doing it in front of them. And then we have a lack of understanding about what happens to certain groups of kids, like LGBT students, who are bullied at roughly 2 to 3 times the rate of other students and bullied in pretty severe ways. But there's a lack of understanding about that and a lack of understanding, number one, that they are bullied more than others, and there's some other kind of funny ideas out there about what we should do about that. The other thing is a lack of understanding about how to investigate bullying. Because the way that the school cultures are set up right now, most school cultures, when you try to investigate a situation like this, what you get is a he said, she said. You get, well, this kid's been doing this to me, and bullies, you know, another great thing that they're very good at is turning the tables on the target. And doing things like, well, he's just being sensitive, he's, you know, I was just teasing, I was just kidding. Or actually, he started, he was doing it to me, and I was just kind of, you know, trying. They play those games, and they're very good at avoiding blame, deflecting blame, and turning the tables. And so you find yourself as an administrator wanting to tear your hair out because you don't really know for sure what you're looking at. Who's telling the truth, or what's going on. And the fact that witnesses won't come forward leaves you in that position. So that's problematic. And that leads to then the real solution, and the most effective solution, and that is you have to change the culture of the school with regard to bullying. You have to create a culture in which the kids say, we don't do that here. In which the adults all sign on and say, we don't do that here. It's about a process. Bullying policies don't do anything because they don't change the culture. You all remember when Title VII, you put it, there was a sheet that said, you know, no discrimination, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it was up over the copier. Well, that worked, didn't it? Remember how that just changed the whole culture? Right? Well, it didn't change cultures in schools either to have an anti-bullying policy. That's not the point. Actually, the most effective strategies are when the whole school community is brought together and after doing some sort of a valid assessment of really how much is going on in a school, educating the whole school community. That means cafeteria workers, parents, students, teachers, administrators, educating all of them about, number one, this is what we have found in our school. No kidding around, we know that this is happening in our school. And here's what it does to kids. This is what it does to the kids who engage in bullying. This is what we can, there are some trajectories we can be worried about. This is what it does to the targets of bullying. And these are serious. And you know what happens is that it gets people worked up. When they hear those things, and they hear what happens to somebody who's trapped in a true bullying situation, the school community goes, okay, that stops. Then you spend a year or so developing an anti-bullying policy. Now, I just said the policy is not the important thing. The reason it's not the important thing is because it's the process of getting there, because when you spend a year and you involve everybody, so you have class discussions, you have focus groups, task forces, all kinds of things, but everybody's involved, parents and everybody else. What you find then is that everybody shifts their understanding, and you bring in information for them, and that shifts their understanding of bullying, and all of a sudden it's okay to rat a kid out for bullying another kid, because we don't do that here. And you change the culture. And with those kinds of approaches, they've seen everything as much as 50 to 70% reduction in bullying in 1 year in longitudinal studies that have shown that it's been sustained, as long as you maintain it. So that's how really it's effectively done. And if you think about it, it's kind of a common sense thing. Because now your witnesses are willing to come forward. The students are willing to stand up and say, hey, we don't do that here. And then they're willing to go get somebody who will intervene if that's what it takes. But we don't have that understanding in the state legislatures. Not on a deep level. Another thing that is a fundamental obstacle is overburdened administrators. And too many of these statutes are doing things that just make life more miserable for administrators, but they're not effectively stopping the bullying. And there's a human tendency, I think, for quick, simple fixes. Discipline, a policy, a curriculum. And we've done it. But we know from the research that it doesn't do it. So, where are the statutes falling down? As you look, as I've looked across them, they fail to require whole school approaches. I would have a couple of four-letter words in every statute when it comes to whole school approach. Shall and must. Right? Because when you may do this, and a lot of statutes will suggest, you may involve the community, you should if you can. Here's one that really bothers me. It sounds like you're asking for this whole school process to develop an anti-bullying policy, but then they say you should have representatives from the various constituencies. Now just think about that realistically for an overburdened administrator. What do? You make a list of 10 people, you call them together, you sit down and you have a meeting one evening with coffee, and since the state says, well, we're going to create a model program or model policy, we'll have a copy of that there. We'll all read it. We'll all talk about it. We'll all have coffee. We'll all vote. Yes, and there it's done. That does not change the culture of a school. So it's a misdirection. Now, I don't think it's because everybody's trying to create a misdirection. It's just I don't think the legislators really understand that won't do it. The fact that they even create model policies is a mistake, because it begs to skip the process and run a copy. So that's a mistake. Lack of funding. It does cost money to do these things, and there are a number of statutes that say if the funds allow, you should engage in a whole school process. But we're not providing any funds, so why would you do that? Unwieldy, overbroad definitions. You remember sexual harassment, where the 6-year-old got suspended because he kissed a little girl on the cheek? Right? That's bullying. We get the same problem with bullying, where these little actions that ought to be dealt with common sense and a teachable moment are treated as if there's some sort of egregious violation. And so one of the problems that we have is that we're sweeping into the term bullying behaviors that may or may not be bullying. And in fact, may be the beginning of bullying, for example. When I was a school administrator, we used to say, put out matches, not forest fires. And a punch thrown in the hallway is a forest fire. So as teachers and administrators, look for the little stuff and intervene. When the little stuff comes along, intervene and do it and you use it as a teachable moment. And so you don't have to blast them. What you do, you pull them aside and say, hey, what's going on here? And then what I always said was, if a kid is misbehaving in any way, I'll start with the lowest level response that works. And if that response doesn't work, I'll twist the screw until I win. Right? But I'm not going to start off with some harsh response, because that's not helpful to kids. That brings up this problem of zero tolerance and these draconian consequences. And as Dr. Limber suggested, I think it does, as a former teacher, I think it does cause you to look the other direction. you know it's draconian, and so you, instead of putting out a match, you let it go. When instead, what you should be able to do is to step in and not turn it into a federal case with reporting requirements and everything else. Just deal with it. And you find out, is it a match, or is it the spark from a forest fire that's going on behind the scenes? But you don't know until you look, and zero tolerance policies to me are nothing more than putting out a match with a fire hose. And so you're not going to do it. We also have some obstacles, blind spots. Higher education, I mentioned this yesterday. I think we've had a blind spot about higher education. I'll just tell you the basic logic. We know a whole lot about K-12 bullying. We know about its dynamics, we know about its prevention, we know a lot. We also know a whole lot about adult workplace bullying. There's been a lot of research. It's just as devastating, just as damaging, and it operates on mostly the same principles. Why in the world do we think that bullies go on vacation for 4 to 7 years and then pick it up again? They don't. And, you know, I kind of stumbled onto this because my work was with the K-12 stuff and the laws affecting it. And I ended up, and somebody was saying, you ought to be looking at law school bullying. And I said, what? Because I had the same reaction, what? Well, then I got to thinking about it, and then I heard some anecdotes from around the country, and then I began calling some people and saying, where are you seeing this around the country? And then I thought, okay, well, I'll go research this. I went out there and wasn't anything out there. And that's how I met Dr. Limber. I called her and I said, hey, where am I not looking? And she says, well, I'll get back to you in a week. And she called back, she says, you know what? We've overlooked this. We haven't been looking at it. And so that's why I'm not an empiricist and don't want to be, but I got an empiricist to work with me. We started our first study, and we're going to go national with it, I'm hoping, this spring, what we just did with our law school, to get some real data. But what we found is exactly what I kind of guessed would be true. Law schools are the perfect storm. They have the worst characteristics of lower schools and the adult workplace that make for bullying cultures, that allow bullying to flourish. They're a perfect storm. And we found out that that's pretty much true. And by the way, one of the things we saw most frequently was in the survey, because what we did, we didn't ask if you'd been bullied. What we did is we made a list of negative behaviors that, if they were repeated over time, would become bullying. And then we asked about, have you seen this? Has this happened to you? How often? Et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things we found was that cyberbullying was way up on the list of frequency. That they're seeing it in text messages flashed around a class, in the middle of class, instant messaging and things like that happening right during class as professors are teaching, and assuming everybody's, well, let's be honest, we assume that they're on the computer checking emails and looking at eBay, but some of them, and it's not a huge percentage, you don't need a big percentage, some of them are ridiculing and tormenting other students in front of the rest of the students, but the professor never sees it. Anyway, we know that. Dr. Limber mentioned that we have blind spots with regard to the training of the adults, that we're not really training teachers, administraters, how to deal with this stuff. That's a blind spot, and the statutes typically are not addressing that. I'll tell you something else. We talk a lot about K-12 bullying. Are we talking about bullying among the faculty? Workplace bullying is rampant in the K-12 schools, as it is on law faculties and other faculties at universities, as it is anywhere. And you know why? Because it's a human thing. You get a critical mass, you have a percentage of people who operate by bullying others. That's how they operate. And by the way, by the time you're into higher ed, you have the cream of the crop. The best bullies in the country are going to medical schools. That's true. I mean, it just makes sense. Misguided LGBT provisions. Let me just read This is the Missouri statute, and I actually wrote an article about it, about how bad it is and how wrong it is, and sent it methodically to every Missouri legislator, so I'm not hiding here. I've actually insulted them directly. But this is what it says. First of all, it was a 7-page statute that the chair of the Education Committee reduced to 4 paragraphs. And this is what one of the paragraphs says. Each district's anti-bullying policy shall be founded on the assumption that all students need a safe learning environment. Policy shall treat students equally. Well, that sounds great, right? And shall not contain specific lists of protected classes of students who are to receive special treatment. So you are not, in other words, to list categories of students who administrators need to be paying attention to. And what we know from the research is that, for example, LGBT students are more often targeted, but they also are not responded to by administrators, by and large. And without any kind of policy that says that administrators are supposed to respond to gay-based bullying, they respond maybe 10% of the time when they know about it. They respond 10% of the times they actually know a kid is being bullied, and a lot of times that response is, well, quit being so gay. I think does that surprise you at all? Administrators with education degrees, doctorates, I'll tell you, read the cases over and over. What the kid got was, stop being gay. What'd you expect? So it's the target's problem. Then we have the overly demanding reporting requirements. I love this one. Actually, New Jersey has a pretty good statute, but the reporting requirement is just startling, and so I just thought I would read it to you. This will take a minute. I want you to put yourself in an administrator's position. All acts of harassment, intimidation, or bullying shall be reported verbally to the school principal on the same day when the school employee or contracted service provider witnessed or received reliable information regarding any such incident. The principal shall inform the parents or guardians of all students involved in the alleged incident and may discuss as appropriate the availability of counseling and other intervention services. All acts of harassment, intimidation, or bullying shall be reported in writing to the school principal within 2 days of when the school employee or contracted service provider witnessed or received reliable information that a student had been subjected to harassment, intimidation, or bullying. A procedure for prompt investigation of reports of violations and complaints shall provide at a minimum that the investigation shall be initiated by the principal or the principal's designee within 1 day, school day of the report of the incident shall be conducted by a school anti-bullying specialist. The principal may appoint additional personnel. The investigation shall be completed as soon as possible, not later than 10 days from the date of the written report of the incident of harassment, intimidation, or bullying. In the event there's information relevant to the investigation is anticipated but not yet received by the end of the 10-day period, the school anti-bullying specialist may amend the original report. The results of the investigation shall be reported to the superintendent of schools within 2 school days of the completion of the investigation and in accordance with regulations promulgated by the State Board of Education to the Administrative Procedure Act. The superintendent may decide to provide intervention services, etc. The results of each investigation shall be reported to the Board of Education no later than the date of the Board of Education meeting the next following. If I were an administrator, I'd quit and go to law school. I didn't even read it all. Would you consider that a disincentive to seeing? I mean, even if you're the teacher, you have to write a report about it and submit it, and then that gets overburdened. Administrators don't need that. So, what are the solutions, and what do I think that the statute should be requiring? Number one, they should require whole school prevention programs. And they should provide funding for those prevention programs. And some statutes or some legislatures have done that. New Jersey is one. They should provide model programs to choose from, not model policies. Programs that are proven to work and that can be adapted and give some flexibility. They should provide in their statutes a research-based definition of bullying and cyberbullying. Look to the researchers, the people who know what this stuff is, and provide those kinds of definitions. They should require intervention strategies that have flexibility and that are tied to the research. No mediation. I feel pretty strongly about that one. Let me put it a different way than Dr. Limber did. If your house were burglarized, would you mediate with the burglar? I'd like Grandma's silver back. You can have the TV. I mean, what are you supposed to give up that you haven't given up already? Would you have a rape victim mediate with her rapist? A target being bullied by somebody who has more power has given up everything she needs to give up. She does not come to the table to mediate squat. So mediation doesn't work. I think it's worse than doesn't work. It's a sick thing to do to a kid. Our intervention strategies ought to teach and transform kids who engage in bullying behavior, not just punish them. Of course, punishment may be involved. That may be what it requires to get a kid's attention, but that's not the focus. The focus is to intervene and change. Protect the target. Intervention strategies ought to protect the target, and that ought to be the very first thing you worry about. And I'll tell you what you don't do is you don't move the target somewhere else. If anybody's going to move the kid who's doing the bullying. But don't take some kid who's being bullied and say, well, you can go to a different school. How in the world is that okay? But the statutes repeatedly put that as a provision that if the child needs to move, that they have the freedom to do so. Of course, they have the freedom to do so. What needs to be done is to move the bully and to say, you're not going to win the King of the Mountain prize here, which is we're taking you off your mountain. Sensible reporting. Here's a good way I think it might work. Instead of having administrators report, which is what most of these statutes say, report any incidents that you've had. Well, if you're not looking for them, you're not going to find them. And if you report that you have them and nobody else is reporting honestly, then it makes you look like your school's got the problem, doesn't it? What if instead you said annually you have to do a valid assessment that tells you whether or not bullying is going on, and that has to be published? Well, now, the next year when that comes out, it's happening on your watch, it's happening on everybody's watch, but the next year when that doesn't change, guess what it motivates you to do? Figure out how to change it instead of covering it up. And I don't think administrators are evil or mean-spirited. I just don't think they understand. This stuff is underground, and so they say, hey, there's no bullying in our school. I mean, I just don't see it. And they don't understand why that is. I'm going to suggest a carrot and stick approach too for schools. One of the things that'll get a school district to move is knowing it might write a check. And so what I would suggest is this. If a school implements a whole school approach in good faith from an approved list, for example, from the day that implementation begins, if a child is injured by another child, there is a rebuttable presumption that the supervision was reasonable and non-negligent, in other words. And that it can only be that presumption can only be rebutted by substantial evidence that the administrator knew, or that the school knew, that this child was being targeted and was deliberately indifferent to it. But if you don't implement one of these strategies and a child is injured, the presumption is that your supervision is negligent, that that negligence was the proximate cause of the injury, and it can only be rebutted by substantial evidence that nothing you could have done, including an effective bullying prevention strategy, could have prevented this child from being injured. And that, in other words, When would that happen? Well, two kids get in a fight over a girl. That's not bullying, and the school shouldn't have to write a check. But if you can't prove that, then you have a presumption against you that you were negligent, and you're going to write a check to the parents or the kid. Well, I'll tell you what, that'll give school attorneys a lot of incentive to say, we have a bullying prevention program in place next week. On your mark and set, go, or you're going to write a check to some kid. But if you do it, you get the safe harbor. I would also suggest, and some statutes have done this, I would tie accreditation and funding to whether or not these programs are in place. But I'd also go after schools of education. You're not going to get accredited if you're not teaching this stuff. There's got to be serious teaching, particularly with administrators, but teachers as well, about bullying, about what we know about it. And if you want to keep your accreditation, your funding, that's going to happen. Also funding for training for everybody in the school that's going to be working with kids. I'd put that in the statute and do it that way. And I think those are I think that combination would actually change school cultures. And if it changes the school cultures, lots of children are not going to get hurt because of it. And so it's worth doing. By the way, other school disorder tends to go down when bullying goes down, when these programs are implemented. So you actually have multiple effects. So that would be my suggestion of what ought to be happening in the statutory realm. And we don't have to reinvent the wheel, and that's the good news. You know, if somebody said, if the legislature said, you must have a car and start driving your car to work, and your response was, I don't know how to even begin to design a car. Say, well, you go buy one. We have 30 years of research out there. We know what works. You don't have to design it from scratch. What we need to do is get the legislatures up to speed on what's out there, and then let the schools have what's out there and start implementing it. And I think we'll see a dramatic change in the lives of our children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Weddle. Our next speaker will be Lieutenant Joe Laramie. If I can figure out how to do this. That's what you want. Good. I did it by accident. Oh, there you go. Yeah. Got that? Okay.
I'm going to do a little something different. And first of all, I'm going to step out behind that podium. I'm not a behind the podium kind of guy. And I'm going to start off with a video, and then we'll talk about that video. But I want you to pay attention to the participants in the video and the reactions that the participants that are in this video have toward each other. Okay.
Bottom one.
Oh.
Hi guys. Hey. Hi Megan. Hey Jessica. Megan, you're a tramp. Ryan Fitch told me you guys made out. Everybody knows. He said your breath smells like garbage. And you almost puked. He says you're the most desperate girl he knows, besides your mom. How many boyfriends does she have anyway? Lots? Your makeup makes you look like a clown. That zit is huge, zit face. Ugly.
How many people were in the video? 5. How many spoke? 1. All right. Why didn't the other participants that were in this video, why didn't they speak? Shock. You know what people do when they're in shock? They basically do one of two things. They underreact or they overreact. And that's really going to be my message, is that we have a problem that we're not reacting appropriately to. And how do we get the right people to be involved in reacting to it? So let's start with, where do we start? Now, as a police officer, I went through training in the police academy and at the police academy following my initial police academy work. That's repetitive. Why do police officers go through repetitive training? They go through repetitive training because when the bad thing happens, we effectively turn into teenagers. Our brain shuts down. That's what people do when they're inundated with stressors. Well, you don't want your police officers shutting down. You want them reacting appropriately, and the way that you train your police officers to react appropriately is you give them this message over and over and over again, so that when the bad thing happens, they just still know the right thing to do. We need to take that mentality to what took place, what we saw happen there in that video. You had that mom that stood there and was shocked, didn't know what to do. You had the kids who sat there and took it, didn't know what to do. Everybody knows what to do after you've thought about it and maybe you've thrown some things out there, but it's too late, because we need to be able to react appropriately when the bad thing happens. Now I'm going to show you a picture that's going to come up here on the screen, and I'm going to tell you as a police officer is very offensive to me that I have to do this. Put a fire truck in my presentation. Do we have any educators in the room? A couple times a year you're going to see one of these pull up in front of your school, aren't you? They're going to get out, they're going to come walking into your building, and they're going to disrupt the learning environment for a period of time so that they can prepare you for something that is not going to happen in your building this year. It hasn't happened in a building in the United States in 50 years. There has not been a child killed in a fire in a school building in 50 years in the whole United States. But yet you still let those people come into your building, disrupt your environment, and let them plan for something that's not going to happen. Now, please don't misinterpret what I'm saying, as we should stop fire drills. But we should be planning for something that's happening in every single building on every single day. And that's a technology-related incident. I really believe that we need to have an incident response team. A plan in place that comes from a real, deliberate discussion about the issues. And you need to have the team in place before you come up with a plan. You can't have somebody that says, well, this is what we're going to do, and let's bring all these people in here and we'll talk about what we're going to do. It doesn't work that way, because you're going to be requiring a number of different disciplines to come together to talk about these issues and how their discipline perceives things. I think I heard this a couple times this morning. To assess, you have to analyze, where are you in this situation. Now there's an organization that I've done some work for, the iKeepSafe is what it's called, the Internet KeepSafe Coalition, and iKeepSafe has a program called Generation Safe. Generation Safe provides resources for schools to address these kinds of issues. There is some cost that goes to having Generation Safe, to being a Generation Safe school, but there is no cost if you go onto their website and you find their assessment forms. And you can do your own assessment of what is taking place in your own buildings and where you stand in dealing with technology-related incidents, cyberbullying included. And then you can come up with your incident response plan. You have to have the right players in place. You have to know where you are before you can know where you're going. And then, I think you talked about it, you need to educate your educators. You need to educate the staff on what you're going to do. You need to educate your students on what your expectations are. You need to educate your parents on what the expectations are. Everybody needs to know where you are on this situation. But you need buy-in. And so you don't get buy-in by telling people. You get buy-in by including people and getting them to participate in the process. And then you go back and you evaluate. Did this work? Every single major criminal incident that I was investigating, involved in, bad thing that happened, at the end of that, you do a critical briefing. You figure out what worked, what didn't work. And it's not to assess blame, it's to learn. It's to grow and to be better so that when the bad thing happens the next time, you do a better job of evaluating and assessing and addressing. Now, responding to tech issues, I know cyberbullying is happening with technology. That's the definition of cyberbullying. But I also know that tech issues include so many more things. And my perspective is that I don't think we should be calling it cyberbullying because of that one part of it, imbalance of power, and, well, there's two parts of it, imbalance of power and repetitiveness part of it. I think there's a lot of abuse that's taking place online that is abusive and is nasty, mean-spirited, but doesn't fall into that definition. And so the digital abuse aspect of it. But they need to respond quickly, and a couple of these things are going to fit together really, and these are not in order. We'll put the first three up here because these really all are simultaneous. You have to respond quickly, and remember I said if you are in shock, you don't know what to do, then what you end up doing is either underreacting, overreacting, or at minimum, delay reacting. Saving until Monday, because this always happens about 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, doesn't it? Saving it till Monday is not an option for that kid who has to spend the whole weekend worrying about what's going to happen on Monday. So you have to respond quickly to it. But the only way that you can is to know what to do. You have to respond consistently. And this, for me, is a real strong message across the bow to administrators and superintendents. Educators are telling me repeatedly that their big problem is that their administration doesn't respond consistently. That they're afraid to take a stand because they're not going to be defended, they're not going to be helped through the situation. And if you see that there is an overreaction or underreaction from one other issue of a staff member, then you relate that to what would happen to you if you were involved in that as well. So, and then the policy aspect of it. Is there a policy for this? Because that really does define things for whether or not you can or can't do what you're going to do to discipline, to address, to motivate, to inspire. And then I can ask you from a law enforcement perspective, please don't tamper with the evidence. And that does happen. And if you don't know how to deal with the evidence, then that creates problems. So that's where the incident response plan really does come into play, is having your local law enforcement to be involved in the process of helping you. And when I suggest that law enforcement comes to the table in the very beginning, I think that's so important. I wrote a blog recently on that topic of getting the police to know the philosophy of the school, so that when there is an issue, the law enforcement officer, their first job when they come in, if they don't know you and you call them, their first job is, I'm going to put this person in jail. I'm going to go after this person and prosecute this person because that's my job, that's what I do. But if there's a relationship between the school and the law enforcement officer, that they know the philosophy, that maybe I come in and I sit down and I go, okay, well, what's really in the best interest of this situation and this person? Because I can have this conversation and discussion with more of a colleague instead of an adversary. So that relationship is huge in this process. And then, is this preventable? And that goes back to what Dr. Limber was talking about and the prevention messaging that's out there. You can say law enforcement has played the card pretty well over the last a number of years on all the bad stuff that's on the internet, and we're hopefully changing that philosophy and making it more about personal protections instead of trying to use scare tactics. Scare tactics don't work. Those who put the wreck, the car wreck on the parking lot of the school right before prom, thinking that they're going to influence the kids not to drink on prom night, it doesn't work because none of those students will ever put themselves in that car. That's somebody else that did that. That's somebody else that had that happen. So that's why I think that it's really important that we focus on this personal responsibility. You have to place them into the situation, and I focus on name. It's going to follow them around for the rest of their life, isn't it? Their identity, that's who they are, that's their persona online, and it's a reputation. I did a presentation at Future Business Leaders of America. It was held here in Columbia, a statewide organization of high school kids. At that time, I was living in St. Louis, and I was driving up here, and I'm going up Highway 70, and this car passes me. And this is a kid, probably about 20 years old, and he's got a giant mohawk. He's got on his right side of his head, he's got it shaved into a checkerboard. He's got a giant wooden earring. You know, I actually drove around to the other side of his car. I wanted to see what the other side of his head looked like. It was just shaved flat. He had two different sides, but I thought, I've got a daughter that's about your age, and I'm really glad you're not dating my daughter. And then I thought about it. And I thought, well, that's not right. I don't know this kid. I have no idea who he is. But what did he give me? He gave me his identity. He gave me a little snippet of who he was as he drove past me and I went around him. He gave me that little snippet that I made a decision based upon my personal feelings and my personal prejudice about his reputation. See, that's what kids are doing every single day online. They're giving personal snippets out there about themselves by what they say, how they treat each other, how they interact, and it creates a reputation. Now, what's really important to note is that that word is neutral. That word is not good or bad. So we can influence up or down. And we can talk about the majority of the kids are doing the right thing, because I really think that we need to change our philosophy and talk about, in the prevention side, what the positive aspects of kids are and not focus on the negative aspects. And so when we use statistics, use the positive side, because typically those positive sides are going to be greater. What do you want to do? You want to inspire kids to do the right thing that other kids are doing the right thing with. Before I finish up, I want to play this video. There's a program from Trend Micro. It's called What's Your Story? It's a contest. I'm going to promote their contest here. Kid won $10,000. The kids, a couple of them, won $10,000 for doing this video. And every year they have this contest, and it's coming about again. And so I just really do recommend that you look at What's Your Story. And then I'll talk briefly about it, and I'll be done.
This is a line, and this line is mine. You will kindly find my feet and my spine are perfectly aligned. You'll also find that on either side is a plus and a minus sign. Right now I'm on this line, minus this. Now I'm on line. This is a line, and this line is mine. You will kindly find my feet and spine are on the plus side. Now I'd like to assign and also define what one might find on this side of the line. I will not pretend that there are no consequences of saying something offensive online, no matter what my ignorant friend says. Because words are all I have, and yeah, I know it's sad. We hide behind the mask of the latest social networking fad. So there's respect to my status, whether through Mark Zuckerberg or Tom, and I'll treat you the same in person, and yeah, I'll accept your friend request, Mom. This is a line, and this line is mine. You will kindly find my feet and my spine are on the minus sign. Now I'd like to assign and also define what one might find on this side of the line. Now I might seem unassuming, but if you only knew what I was doing, brewing, spewing, spitting venom when I'm at that screen, I ruin. Reputations I will splatter. Typing faster, I get madder. All the insults I will gather. You're so lucky, it's only sadder. Day. You have one day. Oh yes, Sunday, for my words to die away. And on that one day, oh I must say, you're gonna wish you had a different name. But then it's Monday, and at school, I'll remind them all of what I said. Then it's Tuesday, then it's Wednesday, then we'll all find out you're dead. This is a line, and this line is mine. And now that I've assigned what one might find on either side, you will kindly find that my feet and my spine are on the plus sign. And I'm not moving. Where are you?
It's really good. What I believe in changing culture. And you talked about that, and I'm very intrigued by a study that MTV did with their program A Thin Line, which deals with online abuse of behavior. And that study 2 years ago, in 2009, gave a number, and I'm sorry I don't remember off the top of my head what that exact number was, but it gave a number of kids who were upstanders, people who stood up for others being abused online. And there was a 20% increase to 2011 in that number. And I think that some of the work that's being done in our schools and getting kids to believe that this is an issue and the culture is changing, but we still have a long way to go. But there are really strong indicators that we can affect change. And doing things that you talked about, Professor Weddle, was about getting the whole buy-in from the school and having it be part of what is acceptable behavior is so truly, truly critical. And I just want to finish up. I'm a local person, so if you have any questions, I wanted to offer my contact information for you to call me or send me an email. I'd be glad to talk to you about some of these issues if you have anything further. But I did want to say, before I finish up, a very, very fine thank you to the staff and the students here at the University of Missouri School of Law for what a wonderful event that they've put on. They've been wonderful hosts, and I really appreciate the opportunity for this invitation, for the opportunity to meet my fellow presenters and panelists. And thank you very much. Thank you.
As usual, we have time for questions and answers, Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question of either of our two panelists, you can just come to the microphones. These are now open microphones, and I'll sum up in a few minutes when we're done. It's always a good sign when there are no questions. Are there any? Are these folks leaving, or are they coming down the microphone? Yes, please, go ahead.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. I just had a question. If cyberbullying, as we learn to be, as pervasive and harmful as it is, as a law student, I'm always very interested in what happens after the act or during the alleged act. As a fellow commentator pointed out, I would agree that we need some hard and fast definition for what this is so we have a standard to measure it. And also, what penalties do you believe would be appropriate to both deter future bad behavior and punish the present behavior?
Well, I'll go back to what I said before, which is I think it depends on what has happened. I think the point of intervention should be to stop the behavior, and so sometimes there needs to be an actual disciplinary measure, and sometimes there doesn't. Sometimes just making somebody aware that you're aware, say as an administrator, and getting them to understand what it is they've just done. But if it begins to repeat, then you begin to turn up the pressure till you win. So I know that's not a very specific response, but then you also know as a law student that facts change things, and incidents are not identical. And so you've got to have the flexibility to deal with what you're really looking at, and not get yourself trapped in a here are my responses and I can do no other situation, because then you can end up losing a teachable moment. You can end up doing something grossly unfair, or do something that is not adequate. Well, I think there has to be enough flexibility in those who are going to respond for them to respond intelligently and match the response to what's really happening.
And for me, on the criminal side, the law enforcement side, that is the last option.
Yes.
I really, we don't want to be criminalizing adolescent stupidity, and sometimes that's really what it is. It's just a kid being stupid and not thinking through the consequences of their actions. But at the same time, I think that if we look at responding quickly, we can fend off a lot of these issues before they get to the time to call the police out.
I think also in terms of law students, if that's what you're asking, this goes to character and fitness. And I think it's worth reminding somebody who's become involved in this that this goes to character and fitness. And depending on the severity at the moment, or whether it's going to become more severe, we may feel obligated to report that to the bar before you take your exam. This is a standard in the profession. I hear every once in a while people say, well, if law students can't take a little bullying, how are they going to be lawyers? And my response is, you don't get to bully out there in the legal field. Bullying is a personal attack. You pull that stuff in front of most judges, they'll put a stop to it right now. And when I worked with attorneys, we didn't attack each other personally. I know there are jerks out there, but they were seen as jerks. So it is not a professional skill to slice and dice another individual. So I don't accept that when I hear that law students need to be able to take it. No, nobody has to take personal, targeted, ongoing attacks. And I think it does go to character and fitness if a student is engaging in that sort of behavior over time.
My experience with school districts is that they are very powerful and very defensive, and most agencies of government do not want to take them on. I used to do a lot of special education law, and I had a child in a small rural school district who had an aide, and he was moderately disabled, almost purely profoundly deaf and no language. One day, the aide went into the bathroom and saw he was being sodomized by another boy. She reported it to the principal and to the special education director, and they told her, don't tell the parents. She left the school district, and that went on for another semester. The kid was really, really profoundly distressed, as were the parents. This case eventually ended up in federal court. The school district never admitted that anything happened. And virtually, other than a money penalty, nothing did happen to them. And so I just think that there is a lot of resistance, and I hope things do change, but the past does not forecast good things to me.
I will say one thing encouraging, maybe, and I was a little surprised when it happened. We're having a conference in Kansas City on bullying. It's our International Bullying Prevention Association. So because we were thinking of coming to Kansas City, I went out and was trying to find out, what kind of support would we get. And I was asked to meet with superintendents at the Chamber of Commerce. They have a superintendent's meeting. And I said, I had 10 minutes, and so what I did is I walked in and I said, look, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about what I'm talking about. Here's what bullying really is. Here are the effects, and I just listed the effects. And then I said, you need principals, building principals have to be on board if you're going to do whole school prevention, and you're really going to do something. I had several districts, big districts, right then say all of our principals will be there for the 2 days. We now have 300 principals in the Kansas City area that superintendents committed them to be there. And one of the sales points, I just said, look, I don't want this to be a conference. I want it to be a catalyst for a reform effort. So I want to build some sort of structure down the road that will take that and so your schools can work together and start to really have an impact. So I guess my response is you can shatter some of that resistance once you tell people, here's what bullying actually does to people. Now, being callous enough to let a kid get sodomized, that's a pretty tough one. But I think what encouraged me was that these superintendents jumped on board, immediately. And they want their principals there, they want their counselors there, and so on. And they're excited about an ongoing effort. And I told them, don't kid yourself. You're talking about changing the culture of your schools. That means whole school approaches. It means taking significant time and effort. And they all jumped on it. So, I think sometimes when you hit reasonable people with the real effects, it changes.
I think that there's another philosophy that we need to play the card toward, and that is called the burden of knowledge. If you know something, then you have an absolute responsibility to address that burden that you've been given. And we need to give more of this burden of knowledge to our schools, our superintendents, and the insurance companies that represent them as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Insurance companies seem to understand that they can be liable.
Do we have any other questions? Well, thank you very much to you both. Let me just sum up. For those of you who are not law students here, you should know that I have a very well-deserved reputation at this law school. That at the end of a 50-minute class, all the students are on the edge of their seats. So I know that some of you are on the edge of your seats as I sum up for about 10 minutes, but I'm going to use co-director's privilege as Professor Wells did and try to sum things up a little bit. We've heard in the last 2 days some extraordinary speakers. When we put this program together in July, we were certainly hoping for good people. We really did get 10 all-stars. I've been to other symposiums, and I've never seen a cyberbullying symposium that is as good as what we heard today and yesterday. Now we've heard a variety of speakers talk about a variety of issues and disagree with each other a little bit, agree with each other most often, I think. But despite the variety of attitudes that have been expressed, I think there's one common denominator in everything we've heard the last 2 days, and that is that this is a serious issue. We know more about the effects of bullying, the psychological and emotional effects on children, than we did even 15 years ago, and certainly 30 or 40 years ago, whenever I was in school. I can't do the math standing up here, so I graduated high school in 1969. I don't know how long ago that was, but I could probably figure it out soon. But the hurtfulness of it is something that we really can't deny. We can have different ideas about what statutes should say, what school officials should do, but the root core of the problem is something that is, it seems to me that it's almost not debatable. So I'd like to suggest that the attitudes of legislators, the attitudes of school officials, teachers, parents, is key, and I think that the attitudes would be more pro-protective if people looked at anti-cyberbullying initiatives as disability legislation, anti-disability legislation. About 35 years ago, when Congress passed what is now called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the IDEA, it was revolutionary. Here it was, Congress in 1975 passing the act. It used to be called, at that time was called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, imposing on local school districts the obligation to educate every child regardless of disability. Disabilities being able to range everything from something that's relatively minor and may not even be noticed sometimes, attention deficit disorder, to some disabilities that are really, really serious and horrible for the people and the families that have them. Today we take disability legislation for granted. It costs money, you may not like it, but it's been a long time since I heard anybody suggest that we should go back to the pre-1975 days and throw kids out of school or not let them in, which some states did. There were state statutes that said that if the school authorities found a child to be ineducable, or if they terribly disturbed other students because of the appearance of their disability, that you didn't have to give them an education at all. They could warehouse them until they could drop out. That was a national heritage ever since we passed the Mandatory Education Acts in the late 1800s. So it was revolutionary then. It's not revolutionary 35 or 40 years later, and we have to get to a point where anti-cyberbullying, anti-bullying legislation is not revolutionary either. I think that the analogy works for two reasons. First of all, bullying is a disability. The reason we have the IDEA and the reason why we recognize the special needs of emotionally and physically handicapped students is because a physical or emotional handicap can deprive a student or restrict the student's opportunity to the free public education that state statutes and constitutions afford. Well, same thing with bullying. It is hard to learn. It may be impossible to learn when you're afraid to go to school, when your stomach is churning while you're in school, when you're watching over your shoulder. And in that respect, bullying is a disability. Now, it is true that most kids do not commit suicide when they're bullied. Too many do, but most don't. But even for the ones who don't, researchers, child specialists, pediatric specialists, recognize bullying as a form of child abuse. It just happens normally to be perpetrated by other children and not by adults. But the same psychosomatic manifestations that abused and neglected children feel, the bedwetting, the depression, the anxiety, the churning stomach, and so forth, the desire to be truant, to stay out of school, to drop out of school, happens with bullied students as well. So we really are talking about a disability. Yes, it's true that the term bullycide, as in suicide, bullycide is becoming a term of art among pediatric professionals, even though most kids don't commit suicide. But the physical manifestations deprive victimized children of their opportunity for public education in much the same way that other physical or emotional disabilities would affect the children's ability to learn while they're in school. The second reason why I think the analogy makes some sense is because the reaction to bullying is long overdue. In the same way that in 1975, the reaction to the Education of All Handicapped Children's Act, the reaction to education of disabled children was long overdue. We had warehoused children too long. There was a study done that in 1970, 8 million disabled children in this country were either being warehoused or weren't in school at all. We took it for granted. So when the Supreme Court said in the 90s that the IDEA and its predecessor were designed to overcome years of neglect, that is sort of what we're facing. That is sort of what we're facing today. And it has been a history of neglect because, as Professor Rodkin talked about, the history of concern about bullying really began in Scandinavia. It began in Europe in the late 70s and early 80s. After 4 boys in Norway committed suicide after what looked to be bullying. Dan Olveus got things started. But we didn't pay much attention to it in the United States until Columbine, April 20th, 1999 to be exact. We didn't pay much attention to it. What would happen if there was if a kid was bullied and he was beaten up or committed suicide, there'd be an article in the newspaper and we were concerned about it. We didn't have a 24-hour news cycle in those days. It used to last for about 3 days. But the point is we'd forget about it. And it wasn't until after Columbine, when the reports came out, the country was trying to figure out how did this commando-style raid take place, what happened. We find out that the 2 shooters had been bullied for years at Columbine High School. And the pent-up rage led them to pull out their AK-47s or whatever it is they happen to use. The governor of Colorado had a commission. That's what politicians do. They don't know what to do. They appoint a commission. So they had a commission to investigate what happened at Columbine. And several students and parents got in front of the commission and said, bullying has been going on for years. We didn't report it because we knew if we did, nothing would happen. And that was 1999. In 2002, the Secret Service and the U.S. Education Department published a study. They went back and looked at 35 or so school shooting incidents in the prior 25 years. And one common denominator in all of them was that the perpetrators either were bullied or felt they were bullied. So we started paying attention, and legislatures started passing statutes. Some of the statutes are good, some are not, some can be criticized, some not. But the point is, the fact that 48 state legislatures, popularly elected by the people, have said that bullying is something that we need to pay attention to, is a national consensus. That's what participatory democracy is. That there's a national consensus today, as there was in 1975, that this is a disability that we need to address. So I think that's what we've tried to do here in the last 2 days. Now I'm going to. I told you I was going to use the same license that Professor Wells used. She also talked about a movie. She's contemporary and cool. I'm not. So I'm going to talk to you very quickly about another movie, Tom Brown's School Days, 1940, before my time, starring Cedric Hardwick and Freddie Bartholomew. How could you forget that? Tom Brown's School Days the movie was taken from an 1857 British novel that talked about a British public school in the 1830s. The point is that bullying has been around for a long time. But we know more about it today, and our consciousness has been raised today more than it was 50 years ago, even 15 or 20 years ago. And what used to pass for acceptability and what used to pass for safety and quality education just doesn't cut it in the 21st century. In the same way that you can't pick up a newspaper today, you can't pick up a sports page today, any day of the week, without reading articles about concussions. Now, concussions are not new. Human anatomy hasn't changed in the last 10 years. Our attitudes about it have changed. So it's no longer acceptable to say, and we're not even talking here about professional athletes, but it's no longer good enough to say that it's okay for a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 14-year-old high school kid to have his bell rung in a football game or a soccer game or something and have it be part of life, because we know now, we didn't know or didn't think about it 15, 20 years ago, but we know now that there are people in their 40s and 50s that are facing dementia because of what happened to them in high school sports 30 or 40 years ago. It's not good enough to say, well, the equipment that kids wore in the 1960s kept them alive. The rules that they played by in the 1960s kept them alive. It's not good enough to say that because we know too much today. And we know too much today about bullying. We're learning about cyberbullying. But I think most of us can agree that this is a problem that we need to take careful cognizance of in the same way that we need to take careful cognizance of what's going on in the sports field when we're talking about concussions. One of the reasons why consciousness has been raised about concussions needs to be used in the cyberbullying field, and that is to publicize this. If you talk to people about bullying, if you listen to some of the people here talking, if you look at some of the absolutely disgusting comments that are passed in the social media from kid to kid, I mean, no decent person could appreciate it. And that's what we need to do with publicity. And when we publicize this difficulty, people pay attention. And that's one of the reasons why Professor Wells and I and the board of staff and editors chose cyberbullying as our example, as our annual topic this year in the symposium. I mean, the fact that you folks are here and the audience, at the end of every semester when the students, there is a tradition at the law school that the last class, no matter how bad they thought the class was, the students do stand up and give a polite round of applause to the faculty member. It makes us feel good. But before I let the students give me their round of applause, I turn around and applaud them. So thank you all for coming. Professor Wells and I applaud all of you now, and take these lessons back with you, the folks who are educated and boots on the ground, who are the front lines, and put some of this work, put some of this knowledge to work, because it really does work if you actually use it. So Professor Wells and I will applaud you, and then you can applaud us.